Sometimes the smallest part doesn't repair the machine. It exposes the biggest lie. The service bay of Bennett Luxury Motors shimmered beneath rows of white LED lights, every polished surface reflecting the prestige of the nation's most exclusive automotive dealership. Imported supercars rested like museum pieces beneath spotless ceilings, while customers in tailored suits sipped espresso from porcelain cups, trusting every word spoken by the technicians in black uniforms embroidered with silver logos. It was a place where expensive answers were rarely questioned. Claire Bennett stood quietly beside a deep metallic blue electric hypercar, her arms folded as she listened to the service manager deliver the diagnosis. At 36, she carried herself with effortless confidence, dressed simply in a cream blazer and dark jeans that revealed nothing about the fortune behind her name. Very few people inside the dealership knew that the woman waiting beside the car was the majority owner of Bennett Automotive Technologies. Today, she had come alone, using only her first name on the service paperwork. Brandon Hayes, the dealership's senior service manager, closed the diagnostic tablet with theatrical confidence. "I'm afraid the battery management system has suffered catastrophic failure." He paused just long enough to let the words settle. "The entire battery assembly has to be replaced." Claire frowned slightly. "How much?" Brandon didn't hesitate. $200,000. Several nearby customers glanced over. One man let out a low whistle. Another technician slowly nodded as though the number sounded perfectly ordinary inside a building where six-figure repair bills weren't uncommon. Claire looked through the windshield at the silent dashboard. The car was running perfectly yesterday. "These systems fail without warning," Brandon replied smoothly. "Unfortunately, modern technology isn't reparable anymore." At the far end of the service lane, a faded red pickup rolled quietly into the parking area. No one paid attention. A man climbed out carrying a worn metal toolbox whose corners had long ago lost their paint. His denim work shirt had oil stains that no detergent could completely erase, and the sleeves were rolled above forearms marked by years of honest labor. Ethan Walker locked the pickup before opening the passenger door for his 9-year-old daughter. "Stay inside the waiting area, Lily," he said gently. "I'll only be a minute." She smiled and hugged a sketchbook against her chest. "Okay, Dad." Ethan nodded before walking toward the counter, intending only to pick up a small electrical connector he had ordered days earlier. As he passed the hypercar, Brandon's final sentence drifted across the polished floor. "There's simply no other solution." Ethan slowed. Not dramatically, not to interrupt. His eyes settled on the vehicle for barely 5 seconds. He noticed the warning indicator reflected faintly against the glass. He heard the cooling pump cycle once, then stop. He caught the almost imperceptible click of a relay failing to complete its sequence. He looked toward Brandon, then back at the car. Finally, he spoke in the calm voice of someone commenting on tomorrow's weather. Actually, every conversation nearby seemed to soften. "That isn't a battery failure." Brandon turned with visible irritation. "And you are?" Ethan offered a polite smile. "Just someone who spent a long time listening to machines." A few technicians exchanged amused looks. Brandon folded his arms. "This isn't an old pickup truck. I know. The repair requires replacing the entire battery pack." Ethan glanced once more toward the dashboard. "No." His answer remained quiet. "It needs a $14 Hall effect current sensor." Silence lingered for half a heartbeat. Then laughter erupted across the service bay. Laughter rolled across the marble floor in uneven waves. Some people laughed openly. Others hid their amusement behind coffee cups and expensive smartphones. A few younger technicians exchanged knowing smirks, convinced they had just witnessed another overconfident backyard mechanic wandering into a world far beyond his understanding. Brandon Hayes let the room enjoy the moment before stepping forward. "I'm sorry," he said, his smile polished and professional. "Did you say a $14 sensor?" Ethan nodded. "Once." "That's right." Another burst of laughter. Brandon slipped both hands into his pockets and looked Ethan up and down. His faded work boots, worn denim shirt, and scratched toolbox hardly belonged among Italian supercars and 7-figure electric hypercars. "Sir," Brandon replied, "this vehicle has over 12,000 sensors, multiple AI-controlled modules, and one of the most advanced battery systems ever built." "I know." "You know? I've read enough about it." The service manager chuckled. "Reading isn't the same as engineering." Ethan simply smiled. No, he answered softly. Listening usually works better. That answer puzzled Claire more than it amused her. She studied the stranger again. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't speaking louder than necessary. He wasn't even defending himself against the ridicule filling the showroom. He stood with the quiet patience of a man who had spent years allowing other people to underestimate him. Beside the waiting lounge, Lily looked up from her sketchbook. She heard the laughter, then searched until she found her father standing alone in the middle of strangers. She had seen that scene before. Different garages, different towns, the same expression on adults' faces. They laughed first. They apologized later. Outside, soft rain began tapping gently against the dealership's enormous glass walls. The gray afternoon light dimmed slightly, leaving reflections dancing across polished vehicles worth more than most homes. Somewhere deeper inside the service center, an impact wrench rattled for several seconds before falling silent. Even the mechanical sounds seemed distant beneath the growing tension. Claire finally spoke. "You seem very certain." Ethan turned toward her. "I'm certain about what I heard." "You diagnosed it without connecting a scan tool?" "I didn't need one." Brandon laughed again. "This isn't 1975. "No," Ethan agreed. "But electricity still follows the same laws." The sentence landed differently. Not dramatic. Not arrogant. Just factual. One of the senior technicians frowned almost imperceptibly. Brandon noticed. He quickly regained control of the room. "Fine," he said. "Let's assume, for one entertaining moment, that you're right." He walked toward the disabled hypercar and tapped the carbon fiber hood with the back of his hand. "Tell everyone exactly what you think is wrong." Ethan stepped closer. He didn't touch the vehicle. Instead, he looked through the windshield toward the instrument cluster. "The battery pack is healthy." Brandon rolled his eyes. "The inverter is healthy." Several technicians stopped smiling. "The cooling circuit is healthy." Someone quietly lowered his tablet. "The system thinks there's dangerous current flowing where none actually exists." Brandon crossed his arms. "And your miracle diagnosis?" Ethan pointed beneath the front service compartment. "One Hall-effect current sensor is sending corrupted feedback to the battery management controller." He paused. "The computer is protecting a battery that was never in danger." Silence lingered for only a second before Brandon clapped his hands together. "Fantastic." His voice echoed through the showroom. "So now our mystery mechanic is claiming every engineer at Bennett Luxury Motors somehow missed a $14 part." More laughter followed. But this time, it wasn't nearly as loud. Because somewhere in the back of the service bay, one gray-haired master technician had quietly stopped laughing altogether. Respect rarely announces itself. More often, it begins with a single person willing to stop laughing. The gray-haired technician stepped forward from the back of the service department, wiping his hands on a clean shop towel. His name patch read Frank Morrison, 32 years with Bennett Luxury Motors, a man whose reputation had been built not on talking, but on fixing what others couldn't. He looked first at Brandon, then at Ethan. Finally, at the disabled hypercar. "You said Hall-effect sensor?" Frank asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Front current sensor." Frank's brows tightened. "Interesting." Brandon immediately cut in. "Frank, come on. Don't tell me you're entertaining this." "I'm listening." Brandon forced a laugh. "We already ran 3 factory diagnostic scans." "I'm aware." "The software says battery failure." Frank folded his arms. "The software reports what it receives." Ethan answered before Brandon could. "Exactly." Both men looked at one another for the first time. Not like strangers. Like craftsmen recognizing familiar thinking. Claire noticed the subtle change immediately. The laughter had faded. Curiosity had taken its place. Outside, the rain grew steadier, tiny streams sliding down the towering glass walls until the city beyond became blurred and distant. Inside, the polished showroom suddenly felt quieter than before. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with warm rubber and machine oil drifting from the service bays beyond. Somewhere overhead, fluorescent lights hummed softly, filling the silence left behind by the crowd. Frank walked slowly around the vehicle. "What made you rule out the battery?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "The cooling pump." Frank nodded once. "And?" The relay clicked exactly once. Another nod. "The inverter?" "It never attempted a secondary wake cycle." Frank stopped walking. Several younger technicians looked confused. Brandon looked irritated. Claire looked fascinated. Frank glanced toward Brandon. Did anyone manually verify current feedback? Brandon's jaw tightened. The scan tool already. I didn't ask about the scan tool. Another uncomfortable silence. Frank repeated himself. Did anyone physically verify the current sensor? No one answered. Brandon cleared his throat. That's unnecessary. Frank slowly turned back toward Ethan. If you're wrong, I'll apologize. And if you're right? Ethan smiled faintly. The car leaves here today. Brandon suddenly stepped between them. This discussion is over. He raised his voice just enough for everyone nearby to hear. Bennett Luxury Motors follows factory-certified repair procedures. We don't allow random mechanics to experiment on customer vehicles. I'm not asking to experiment, Ethan replied calmly. I'm asking you to verify. Brandon pointed toward the exit. You've made your point. I haven't. You certainly have. No. Ethan's voice remained almost gentle. I've only made a diagnosis. Lily watched her father from the waiting lounge. She noticed what others didn't. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. His heartbeat never seemed to change when people doubted him. Years earlier, after her mother passed away, she had once asked him why he never argued with rude customers. His answer had stayed with her ever since. Truth doesn't become stronger because we shout. It simply waits until people are ready to hear it. Claire remembered those words without ever having heard them. There was something strangely familiar about Ethan's composure. In boardrooms, she had met brilliant engineers who couldn't explain simple ideas without arrogance. Yet this man, standing in oil-stained boots beneath million-dollar lighting, carried knowledge with remarkable humility. She stepped forward. What would you need? Every head turned toward her. Brandon blinked. Claire, there's absolutely no reason. She never looked at him. I wasn't asking you. Her eyes remained fixed on Ethan. If I gave you one opportunity to prove your diagnosis, what would you need? Ethan glanced toward the service bay, then toward the disabled hypercar. Finally, he answered with the same quiet confidence that had unsettled the entire showroom from the beginning. 10 minutes. And a $14 sensor. The room held its breath long before anyone realized it had become silent. Brandon shook his head with an exaggerated sigh. Absolutely not. His words echoed sharply through the showroom. This dealership isn't going to let a stranger open a $2 million hypercar because he thinks he heard a relay click. Ethan didn't react. I understand. Good. But I wasn't asking for permission. Brandon frowned. I was answering her question. Claire remained perfectly still. Her eyes never left Ethan. You said you only need 10 minutes. That's right. And a $14 sensor. Yes. Brandon stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. Claire, this is absurd. If he damages the battery pack, the liability alone could exceed $500,000. She answered without looking at him. What if he doesn't? He will. How do you know? Because factory procedures exist for a reason. Frank Morrison quietly cleared his throat. Factory procedures also tell us to verify sensor inputs before replacing an entire battery assembly. Brandon's jaw tightened. We already ran diagnostics. Frank nodded. And diagnostics are only as honest as the information they're given. The sentence lingered in the air. No one replied. Rain continued drumming softly against the enormous windows. Outside, passing headlights shimmered through sheets of water, turning the afternoon into blurred streaks of silver and gold. Inside, the scent of warm electronics mixed with fresh coffee as customers abandoned their conversations, slowly gathering around the hypercar. Some recorded with their phones. Others whispered predictions. No one wanted to miss what happened next. Claire finally broke the silence. What exactly would you do? Ethan walked toward the front of the vehicle. He never touched it. He simply pointed beneath the forward service compartment. I'd disconnect the auxiliary power. He pointed again. Remove the inspection panel. Another motion. Verify current readings manually. He looked at Claire. If I'm correct, the sensor will already be reporting impossible values. And then, I replace it. That's all. That's all. Brandon laughed once more. You make it sound like changing a light bulb. Ethan smiled politely. No, it's easier. Several people chuckled. Not because they found Ethan ridiculous. Because they suddenly weren't sure whether he was joking. Frank certainly wasn't smiling anymore. He looked toward Brandon. Do we have that sensor in inventory? Brandon hesitated. Probably. Frank turned toward one of the parts clerks. Check. The young employee disappeared into the warehouse. Within less than a minute, he returned carrying a tiny sealed package no larger than a deck of playing cards. He looked confused. "We actually have 3. Frank accepted one package and examined the label. Hall effect current sensor. Retail price, $13.87. Someone quietly whispered, $14. The crowd shifted uneasily. Brandon reached for the package. "This proves nothing." Frank didn't let go. "No, but it gives us something to test." Claire folded her arms. "If the replacement takes 10 minutes, what do we lose?" Brandon answered immediately, "Our credibility." Claire slowly turned toward him. "No, we lose credibility if we charge customers $200,000 without proving it's necessary." The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Even Brandon had no immediate response. Claire faced Ethan again. "I'll authorize the work." Brandon stared at her. "You can't be serious." "I am. If this goes wrong," she interrupted him calmly. "If it goes wrong, I'll accept full responsibility." Every employee in the showroom froze. No one had ever heard a customer say those words. Claire reached into her handbag and removed a pen. She signed the temporary work authorization without hesitation. Then she handed it to Ethan. For the first time since entering the dealership, he looked genuinely surprised. Not because someone believed in his diagnosis, because someone was willing to risk their reputation on a man they had met only 10 minutes earlier. He accepted the paper carefully. Then he looked toward Lily. She smiled from across the waiting lounge. She had seen that look before. It always appeared just before her father reminded the world that experience doesn't wear expensive uniforms. Real knowledge is strangely quiet. It never rushes. It never performs. It simply reaches for the right tool. Ethan set his weathered toolbox beside the hypercar without ceremony. The polished showroom reflected his worn steel-toe boots against the mirror-like floor, a sharp contrast to the spotless white sneakers surrounding him. Dozens of eyes followed every movement. Some expected a miracle. Most expected a disaster. He glanced at his watch. 10 minutes, he said softly. Frank Morrison pressed the timer on his phone. "It starts now." Brandon folded his arms. "I hope everyone's paying attention." "Oh, we are," Claire replied. Ethan disconnected the 12-volt auxiliary system before touching anything else. His hands moved with practiced confidence, never hurried, never hesitant. Each motion seemed almost ordinary, yet every bolt landed neatly inside a magnetic tray he carried in his toolbox. There was no unnecessary movement, no wasted effort. The showroom had become so quiet that the metallic click of a single socket wrench echoed across the service bay. Lily watched from the waiting area with a small smile. Her father always worked that way, as though every machine deserved patience, as though every mistake belonged to the mechanic before it belonged to the machine. The front service panel lifted smoothly. Rows of orange high-voltage cables appeared beneath the carbon fiber cover like carefully organized arteries beneath skin. Several younger technicians leaned closer. One whispered, "I've never even seen one opened outside factory training." Another replied, "Neither have I." Ethan ignored them completely. Instead of replacing expensive modules, he reached into his toolbox and removed something unexpected. Not a diagnostic tablet, not a manufacturer interface, a simple digital multimeter. Brandon laughed quietly. "That's your plan." Ethan didn't answer. He connected 2 probes with absolute precision. The tiny display stabilized. He observed the reading for several seconds. Then he looked toward Frank. "Current feedback is negative 148 amps. Frank frowned. "The battery is disconnected." "I know. There shouldn't be any current." "There isn't." Claire stepped closer. "Then why does it show that?" Ethan looked toward the small black sensor mounted beside a copper bus bar. "Because it's lying." The words hung in the air. Not accusing, merely factual. Frank leaned in beside him. "What should the reading be?" 0. "It isn't." "No." "Could the controller be faulty?" Ethan gently shook his head. "If the controller were failing, the value would drift." He pointed at the screen. "This number hasn't moved once." Frank nodded slowly. "A frozen sensor." "Exactly," Brandon interrupted. "Or a damaged controller." Ethan calmly removed the sensor connector. Instantly, the reading disappeared. He looked toward Frank again. "The controller just lost its signal." Frank's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "So the controller is responding?" "Yes." "The wiring?" Ethan inspected the connector pins. "Perfect." "The harness?" "No corrosion." The battery? Healthy. One by one, every expensive possibility quietly disappeared, leaving only one. The $14 sensor. Outside, thunder rolled across the gray sky, followed by another wave of steady rain. Inside, no one noticed anymore. Every customer had drifted toward the service bay. Even receptionists had abandoned their desks. Phones that had once recorded for entertainment were now recording evidence. Ethan carefully opened the tiny package from the parts department. Inside rested a component no larger than a matchbox. Retail price, $13.87. He installed it with deliberate precision, tightening each fastener by feel instead of force. Then he reconnected the electrical system and lowered the service panel without speaking a single unnecessary word. Frank looked down at his timer. 9 minutes, 43 seconds. Ethan stepped back from the hypercar. He brushed his hands together once. Then he looked toward Claire. The repair is finished. Brandon smirked. A repaired car doesn't prove anything. Ethan simply nodded toward the driver's seat. It will. Press the start button. There are moments when truth does not need applause. It only needs someone brave enough to press one button. No one moved. Claire stood beside the driver's door, her fingers resting lightly on the recessed handle. Around her, nearly every employee in the dealership had abandoned whatever they had been doing. Customers formed a silent semicircle around the hypercar. Even the espresso machine in the lounge seemed unusually quiet, its familiar hiss replaced by the low rhythm of rain striking the glass walls outside. Brandon folded his arms tighter. "This proves absolutely nothing," he said. "It hasn't proved anything yet," Ethan replied. "It will." Claire opened the driver's door and lowered herself into the seat. The cabin smelled of fresh leather and carbon fiber, untouched by grease or dust. The massive digital display remained black for a heartbeat, waiting for its command. She looked through the windshield at Ethan. He gave a small nod. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No confident grin. Only quiet certainty. Claire placed her foot on the brake pedal. Her finger hovered above the illuminated start button. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Here we go." She pressed it. The showroom seemed to stop breathing. For one endless second, nothing happened. Brandon smiled. "I told you." Before he could finish, a soft electronic chime echoed through the cabin. The dashboard awakened. One screen, then another. Cooling pumps began their smooth, controlled hum. Voltage indicators stabilized. Green status lights spread across the instrument cluster one after another like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. The large warning message that had dominated the display only minutes earlier disappeared. In its place appeared 5 simple words. All systems operating normally. No alarms. No fault codes. No emergency shutdown. The electric motors entered ready mode with barely a whisper. Claire stared at the display. She checked it again. Then once more. Nothing had returned. Everything was normal. Frank Morrison stepped closer with the factory diagnostic tablet. "Mind if I verify?" Claire nodded silently. Frank connected the scan tool beneath the dashboard. The software loaded. Every technician leaned forward. One by one, the system completed its checks. Battery management system. Passed. Power distribution module. Passed. Thermal control. Passed. High voltage safety. Passed. Stored fault codes. 0. Frank blinked. He ran the scan again. The same result. He looked slowly toward Ethan. "You were right." Not excited. Not shocked. Simply honest. The words carried farther than anyone expected. Brandon immediately grabbed another tablet. There has to be a software reset. He initiated a second diagnostic. Then a third. Each report returned exactly the same conclusion. No battery failure. No inverter damage. No defective battery pack. Only a fully operational vehicle. The laughter that had filled the showroom less than 20 minutes earlier had completely disappeared. No one spoke. Several technicians quietly lowered their eyes. A customer who had been recording since the beginning slowly put away his phone. Another looked toward the tiny empty package resting beside Ethan's toolbox. Retail price, $13.87. Outside, thunder faded into the distance as sunlight began pushing through the thinning clouds. Soft golden light filtered across the showroom floor, reflecting from polished paint and spotless glass until the once cold dealership felt unexpectedly warm. Claire stepped out of the car. She closed the door gently. Then she walked directly toward Ethan. Every employee watched. Every customer waited. She stopped only a few feet away. I owe you an apology. Ethan shook his head. No, you don't. I doubted you. You had every reason to. I judged you. You judged what you could see. Claire lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. And I almost paid $200,000 because of it. Ethan glanced toward the tiny sensor package lying on the workbench. Sometimes, the most expensive mistake isn't replacing the wrong part. He looked around the silent showroom. It's forgetting to question the first answer. No one argued. Because for the first time that afternoon, the entire dealership had nothing left to say. The loudest discoveries are often made in silence, after everyone realizes they were looking at the wrong person. No one returned to work. The hypercar sat quietly in the center of the showroom, no longer a broken machine, but undeniable evidence. The tiny $14 sensor rested inside a clear plastic bag on the workbench, looking almost insignificant beside diagnostic tablets worth thousands of dollars. Yet every eye in the dealership kept drifting back to it. Brandon Hayes stared at the completed repair report as though the numbers might change if he waited long enough. They never did. Frank Morrison broke the silence. I've worked here 32 years. He looked directly at Ethan. I've never seen anyone diagnose that fault without a scan tool. Ethan shrugged lightly. I wasn't diagnosing the computer. Frank frowned. You were diagnosing the car. Ethan smiled. They're not always the same thing. Claire heard something in that answer that reached far beyond automobiles. She stepped closer. Where did you learn to think like that? For the first time that afternoon, Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward Lily, who was quietly coloring at a small table in the waiting lounge. She had drawn a little red pickup beside a much larger blue sports car. Both vehicles were parked beneath the same smiling sun. Only after seeing her did he reply. I had good teachers. Frank tilted his head. Which manufacturer? Ethan chuckled softly. Mostly my father. A few technicians exchanged puzzled glances. You mean he was a mechanic? He repaired farm equipment. Claire looked surprised. And he taught you high-voltage systems? No. He taught me something better. Everyone waited. He taught me that machines tell the truth. The sentence lingered. If you stop trying to prove you're the smartest person in the room, they'll usually tell you exactly what's wrong. No one spoke. Outside, the rain had completely stopped. Shafts of late afternoon sunlight poured through the towering glass windows, warming the polished showroom floor. Reflections danced across chrome wheels and carbon fiber bodywork, transforming the dealership into a place that suddenly felt less like a luxury showroom and more like a workshop where craftsmanship still mattered. Claire studied Ethan carefully. His toolbox was old. His shirt was stained. His hands carried tiny scars collected over decades of honest work. Yet every movement reflected discipline rather than exhaustion. There was something unusual about him. Not confidence. Peace. She found herself wondering how a man capable of diagnosing one of the world's most advanced electric vehicles by sound alone could still be operating a small neighborhood garage. The question refused to leave her mind. What did you do before opening your shop? Ethan looked away. Oh, I worked in engineering. What kind of engineering? A long time ago. Claire smiled gently. I noticed you didn't answer my question. I did. No. You answered when. Not what. For the first time all afternoon, Ethan looked almost uncomfortable. Before he could change the subject, Frank suddenly froze. His eyes had settled on a faint engraving visible beneath years of scratches on Ethan's old metal toolbox. He stepped closer. You've had this box a long time. Ethan glanced down. Almost 20 years. Frank gently brushed away a thin layer of dust from the corner. Tiny engraved letters emerged beneath the worn paint. BAT Prototype Engineering Division. Frank's breathing slowed. He looked from the toolbox to Ethan and back again. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. That division was closed over a decade ago. Ethan gave a small nod. It was. Frank swallowed. Only the original engineering team ever received toolboxes with that engraving. The realization spread across his face before anyone else understood. Claire noticed it immediately. Frank, what is it? He looked at her with eyes that had suddenly filled with disbelief. I think the man who just saved your $200,000 repair bill didn't learn this technology after it was built. He paused. I think he helped create it. The past has a strange habit of remaining invisible until one small detail gives it permission to speak. Frank Morrison never took his eyes off the old toolbox. I remember those, he murmured. There couldn't have been more than 30. Brandon frowned. What are you talking about? Frank ignored him. They were issued only to engineers working on the first-generation high-voltage architecture. Claire looked from Frank to Ethan. You really worked for Bennett Automotive Technologies? Ethan exhaled quietly. A lifetime ago. You never mentioned it. You never asked. The answer wasn't defensive. It was simply true. Claire studied him with growing curiosity. My company has spent years trying to recruit people with experience from that program. Ethan smiled faintly. I know. You know? I've received the emails. She blinked. You ignored them. I did. The showroom grew quiet again. Outside, the clouds had broken completely, allowing golden afternoon light to spill across the glass walls. Dust particles floated lazily through the warm beams, while somewhere in the distance the rhythmic tapping of a technician organizing tools echoed through the nearly empty service bay. The tension that had filled the room earlier had transformed into something gentler, respect searching for answers. Claire folded her arms. Why would someone walk away from work like that? Ethan looked toward Lily. She had finished her drawing and was carefully placing crayons back into a small box, making sure every color returned to its proper place. Only then did he answer. My wife became sick. No one interrupted. I thought I'd have more time. His voice remained steady. I was wrong. Frank slowly lowered his eyes. I left because someone had to be home. Another quiet pause. When she passed away, my daughter still needed breakfast every morning. Lily looked up and smiled at her father, completely unaware that the adults around her had suddenly become silent for a different reason. There were promotions. There were patents. There were awards. Ethan shrugged gently. But none of them could take her to school. Claire felt something tighten inside her chest. She had spent years measuring success through innovation, quarterly reports, expansion plans, and engineering milestones. Standing before her was a man who had willingly traded all of that for packed lunches, bedtime stories, and school recitals. Somehow, his choice didn't look like failure. It looked like courage. Frank finally spoke. You were one of the architects behind Project Helios, weren't you? Several younger technicians exchanged confused glances. Even Brandon looked surprised. Project Helios had become almost legendary inside the company. It was the battery management platform that laid the foundation for every modern electric vehicle Bennett Automotive Technologies produced. Ethan smiled with quiet embarrassment. It wasn't one person, but you were there. I was. Frank laughed softly, almost to himself. I knew I recognized the way you think. Claire stared at Ethan. I've read those engineering reports. They're still used in our training program. She paused. Your name wasn't on them. No. Why not? Ethan looked toward the repaired hypercar. Because the ideas belonged to the team. And because someone else needed the recognition more than I did. Even Brandon lowered his eyes. The words carried no bitterness, no resentment, only peace. Claire understood something in that instant that every business school in the world failed to teach. Real greatness doesn't fight to have its name remembered. It leaves behind work so honest that people discover the author years later. She took one slow step closer. I owe you more than an apology. Ethan gently closed his toolbox. You don't owe me anything. Claire shook her head. No, I think I do. Before Ethan could answer, one of the dealership's administrative assistants hurried across the showroom carrying a tablet. She looked nervous. Mr. Hayes, corporate compliance is on the line. Brandon frowned. They're asking about today's battery replacement authorization. The assistant swallowed hard. They already know it was canceled. She hesitated. And they want to know how many other customers were told to replace perfectly healthy battery packs. Justice rarely arrives with raised voices. More often, it walks in carrying nothing more than the truth. No one noticed Brandon Hayes step away to answer the call. They only noticed that he did not return. The administrative assistant remained frozen beside the reception desk, still holding the tablet with corporate compliance waiting on the line. Around her, conversations resumed in hushed whispers. The excitement of witnessing an impossible repair had quietly transformed into something much larger. This was no longer about a $14 sensor. It was about trust. Frank Morrison slowly removed his reading glasses. If compliance is involved already. Someone at headquarters has seen the repair authorization. Claire nodded thoughtfully. Or they've seen it disappear. She turned toward the assistant. Tell them I'll return the call personally. The young woman blinked. "Yes, ma'am." Only then did she realize whom she was speaking to. Her eyes widened. "Ma'am, you're Miss Bennett?" The question echoed through the showroom. Every employee looked toward Claire. Brandon had never bothered to learn the identity of the quiet woman standing beside the hypercar. He had treated her like any ordinary customer. Claire offered a polite smile. "I am." A stunned silence settled over the dealership. Several technicians straightened instinctively. The receptionist nearly dropped the tablet. Frank simply chuckled. Under his breath. "Well, today has been full of surprises." Outside, the evening sun painted long golden reflections across the wet pavement left behind by the afternoon rain. Inside, warm light stretched through the glass walls, softening every hard edge in the showroom. The polished floors no longer reflected status or luxury. They reflected people who had just been reminded why integrity mattered. Claire walked toward Ethan one last time. "I have a favor to ask." He closed the lid of his toolbox. "If I can, I'd like to visit your garage." Ethan looked mildly confused. "My garage? I want to understand why someone capable of building technology chooses to repair ordinary cars." He smiled. "They aren't ordinary." Claire waited. "They belong to ordinary people." The answer settled gently over everyone listening. Lily walked over and slipped her small hand into her father's. "Ready to go home, Dad?" He looked down at her with the same quiet warmth that had never changed throughout the afternoon. "I think so." Claire watched them together. For years she had searched for brilliant engineers. Today she had found something rarer. A brilliant man who had never allowed brilliance to become his identity. As Ethan and Lily reached the dealership entrance, Frank called after him. "You never answered one question." Ethan turned. Frank smiled. "Why didn't you charge for your diagnosis?" Ethan glanced at the tiny empty sensor package still resting on the workbench. "My father used to tell me something. Everyone waited. If someone comes to you carrying a burden, don't make the burden heavier just because you can." He looked toward Claire. The car was never broken enough to deserve $200,000. Then he gently squeezed Lily's hand. But some people's faith in honest work almost was. Without another word, the father and daughter walked into the golden evening, their old red pickup waiting patiently beneath the clearing sky. No television cameras followed them. No applause filled the air. Only the quiet sound of a little girl laughing as her father opened the passenger door for her, exactly as he had done countless times before. Claire remained standing inside the silent showroom long after they had driven away. She looked once more at the repair report, then at the $14 invoice lying beside it. One represented the cost of a part. The other represented the value of character. She finally understood that Ethan Walker had repaired far more than a hypercar that afternoon. He had repaired something far more fragile. The belief that honesty, dignity, and quiet excellence still had a place in a world where the loudest voices were too often mistaken for the wisest ones.